the IPACC is the object we propose for discussion on this day and the upcoming 2 days. And we have been deeply inspired by the future design methodology from Japanese researchers who use this decision-making strategy to come to a consensus that has embedded in it long-term thinking and intergenerational accountability. This political movement and decision-making strategy organizes a group of participants in a discussion that goes from the present to the future. This group is divided in 2 smaller groups, one enacting the present and another one enacting the future. Inga, can you tell us a bit more about this structure?
Yeah, so just to say a little bit of background of the future design. So this decision-making process has deep connections with the 7th generation principle of indigenous cultures, which urges the current generation of humans to live and work for the benefit of the 7th generation ahead. So it's about 140 years in the future. And 7th generation notion takes its root in the founding document of the Iroquois Confederacy, a historical indigenous confederacy in North America and the oldest living participatory democracy on Earth. And this philosophy is also common in many other Native American nations and indigenous peoples around the world. And we would like to thank Professor Tatsuyoshi Sayo, who is the founder of the Future Design, for his help, inspiration, and generosity in sharing so many insights into the methodology that we are actually really excited to use and to test in the next 2 days. We haven't done it before, so it's going to be an experiment. Both for us and for you and for the participants.
And we also have to give a huge thank you to our upcoming guest, Roman Krznaric, through who we got familiar with a deeper sense of what long-term thinking means and what intergenerational accountability could be in a world marked by this social, institutional, and political short-termism. So, I would like to introduce you all to our next speaker, Roman Krznaric, who is a public philosopher, and his latest book is The Good Ancestor: How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World. His previous international best-selling books, including Empathy, The Wonderbox, and Carpe Diem Regain, have been published in more than 20 languages. Roman has a PhD in political sociology. He's the founder of the first Empathy Museum, and he's currently a researcher at the Long Now Foundation. Tonight, Roman will give us a keynote titled The Art of Being a Good Ancestor. Very much looking forward to it. Roman Krznaric, thank you very much for accepting the invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Bruno, and it's been wonderful to listen to at least part of the performance that just went on, and also to the discussion around with your IPCC contributors, because one of the great things about the IPCC is when you look at the statistics in the reports, they are very, very long term. There's statistics about sea level rises 100 years from now, even 500 years from now. And I think it's an inspiration for us to think beyond the here and now. And that's what I would love to talk to you all about this evening. How do we expand our time horizons beyond the present tense? Because I think we all know that we live in an age of chronic short-termism, that our politicians can barely see beyond the next election or even the latest tweet, that markets spike then crash in speculative bubbles, businesses can't see beyond the quarterly report, nations typically sit around international conference tables bickering away while the planet burns and species disappear. And of course, as individuals, we're looking at our phones and clicking the buy now button. This is the age of the tyranny of the now. And I think we also, most of us intuitively know too, that we need more long-term thinking to deal with the challenges of our century. We need it to plan for the next pandemic that might be on the horizon. We need it to get ready for technological risks that are coming our way from artificial intelligence or bioweapons. We need it to confront racial injustice, which gets passed on from generation to generation. Of course, we need long-term thinking to tackle the global ecological crisis, climate change, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, a lot of the things we've been hearing about already from previous speakers. And there's a kind of paradox here, isn't there, that the need for long-term thinking is incredibly urgent. We need it right here, right now. And one of the ways I think about this issue is that I believe we have colonized the future, that we see the future, particularly in wealthy countries, as a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological degradation and technological risk as if there was nobody there. And it's a bit like the way when Britain colonized Australia in the 18th and 19th century, they drew on a legal doctrine now known as terra nullius, nobody's land. They treated the continent as if there was nobody there. Of course, there was the indigenous population. And I think today what we also have is, to use another Latin phrase, tempus nullius. The future is seen as nobody's time, a similarly uninhabited territory that is ours for the taking. And the tragedy is that future generations aren't here to challenge this pillaging of their inheritance. They're given no political rights or representation. They have no influence at the marketplace. And it can be quite difficult, I think, to grasp the scale of this problem. So I'd just like to share my screen and show you one of the ways that I think about this, that if you think about it, there are 7.7 billion people alive today. And over the past 50,000 years, an estimated 100 billion people have been born and died. But both of these are far outweighed by the nearly 7 trillion people who will be born over the next 50,000 years, assuming current birth rates level off and stabilize. And in the next 2 centuries alone, actually, tens of billions of people will be born. Amongst them, all your grandchildren and their grandchildren and the friends and communities on whom they'll depend. And as I discuss in my book, The Good Ancestor, we can see on the screen there, that this really raises questions about, well, how are we going to be remembered by those generations to come? How would they judge us for what we did or didn't do when we had the chance? And someone who really thought about this issue was the immunologist Jonas Salk, who developed the first polio vaccine back in the 1950s. And he said, the great question facing our civilization is this: are we being good ancestors? In other words, how are we going to be remembered by those generations to come? And he believed if we were going to be remembered well and tackle the challenges of our age, like the destruction of the living world, we would need to expand our time horizons. So instead of thinking on a scale of seconds, minutes, and hours, we need to think on a scale of, decades, centuries, and even millennia. And in some ways, there's good news. There are some really impressive and inspiring long-term thinking, long horizon projects around that we can look to. So think, for example, of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which is collecting millions of seeds in an indestructible rock bunker in the Arctic Circle that's designed to last for 1,000 years, preserving the world's plant biodiversity, really stretching our imaginations forward in time. But how can we make this kind of thinking and action normal? Well, in my book, The Good Ancestor, I talk about a tug of war for time going on between 6 drivers of short-termism and 6 ways to think long-term. A lot of those drivers of short-termism are probably familiar to you: digital distraction or political presentism, the way our politicians are caught in short-term cycles. There are some deeper ones there, like the tyranny of the clock, the way that clock time, mechanical clock time, has been speeding up the clock, particularly in Western culture, since the 14th century, when the first clocks chimed roughly once an hour. By 1700, most clocks had minute hands. By 1800, they had second hands. Time has been speeding up for a long time. And I want to talk to you this evening about just 4 of the ways to think long term: deep time humility, intergenerational justice, developing a legacy mindset, and cathedral thinking. And I want to try and relate them a bit, of course, to art and the role that it can play in expanding our time horizon. So let me begin with deep time, because these ways to think long term are like a mental toolkit for being a good ancestor, as I see it. So deep time, of course, is the idea that humankind is just an eye blink in the cosmic story. And this is really a new idea in Western culture, where until about the late 18th century, the idea was that the Earth was probably only 6,000 years old or so, because that's what the Bible told us. But along came the evolutionary biologists and the geologists telling us that, the Earth must be hundreds of thousands, millions, even billions of years old. But it's quite hard to grasp our insignificance in that cosmic story. So think about it this way. If the age of the Earth is the distance from the tip of your nose to the end of your outstretched hand, one stroke on a nail file on your middle finger erases human history. That's how short we've been around. And it should give us a sense of humility, because who are we to wreak such destruction on the living world in just the 200 years or so of industrial civilization without environmental damage and technological risk? And of course, artists, since the early 19th century, have been exploring the idea of deep time in all sorts of interesting ways. Since first watercolorists started using dinosaur fossils in the 1830s to draw pictures of what the world must have looked like billions of years ago. But today, of course, artists are very engaged in this issue. Someone I'm really inspired by is the US-based photographer Rachel Sussman and her project called The Oldest Living Things in the World, where she spent around a decade photographing living things which were at least 2,000 years old. That was her minimum criteria. So things like, the ancient baobab that you can see there, or the bristlecone pines in California, some of which are up to 4,000 or 5,000 years old. All sorts of plants that you may not know about, and brain corals as well. 2,000-year-old brain coral in Tobago. Isn't that amazing? And even bacteria, 400, 500, 600,000 years old, stretching our imaginations across time through the living world. But there are also different kinds of art and culture projects. Some of them a bit more, let's say, mechanized. So the Long Now Foundation in California, where I'm a research fellow, has a project called the 10,000-Year Clock. They are building a slow time clock inside a mountain in the Texas desert, which is designed to last and stay accurate for 10 millennia. Okay, and you'll be able to visit it by hiking through the desert to go and get there. And each step going up the mountainside will be 1 million years of geological time, and you'll get to this clock. You can see some images of it there, which is like a secular altarpiece to a long-term thinking civilization to get us to take responsibility and think on the scale of a longer now. So that's a little bit about deep time. Now, cathedral thinking is another aspect of long-term thinking which is really fundamental here. It's the idea of embarking on projects with very long time horizons, decades, even centuries, beyond the scale of our own lifetimes. Greta Thunberg, of course, has said we need cathedral thinking to confront the climate crisis. It's named after those medieval cathedral builders who wouldn't necessarily see the cathedrals finished during their careers, but it comes in many different varieties. Of course, there are religious buildings like Ulm Minster in southwest Germany, you can see there in the top left. It was begun in 1377. It wasn't finished until more than 500 years later, in the year 1890, probably the world's oldest crowdfunding project. In the bottom left, there's the civil rights movement in the US, a reminder that cathedral thinking also happens in social and political movements, which sometimes have to engage not just for years, but for decades or even longer to achieve their aims. Civil rights movement, women's rights, indigenous rights movements, sometimes going on for half a century or longer. That's a kind of cathedral thinking. And then on the right-hand side, you can see public works projects, which governments have engaged on with very long horizons throughout history, whether it's the building of the Great Wall of China or what you can see there, which are the sewers built in Victorian London after the famous Great Stink of 1858, where the stench from the smell from the River Thames was so bad because raw sewage was being dumped in the Thames until then, tens of thousands of people dying a year of cholera, but it was so bad in 1858, in the hot summer, even members of parliament couldn't stand the smell. And they passed the emergency legislation to build the sewers, which were built over the next 20 years or so. And the chief engineer made sure the sewers were twice as big as they needed to be, and that's why they are still in use today. That's exemplary cathedral thinking, or maybe you might call it sewer thinking. But of course, these are all inspiring examples of long-termism, what we need to tackle the climate crisis. But it doesn't mean cathedral thinking is always good for us. Just think of how many long-term thinking projects have destroyed the living world, like dams, hydroelectric dams, and the pouring of concrete. Enough concrete has been poured by humankind to cover the whole earth in a spherical concrete coffin 2 millimeters thick. That's not the kind of cathedral thinking we need. We need to build the ecological cathedrals, not the bricks and mortar cathedrals of the future. We need things like rewilding. That's the kind of thing that we need. And think also of the way, of course, Hitler wanted an 1,000-year Reich. That was cathedral thinking. And, you know, in the corporate world too, a former head of Goldman Sachs, Gus Levy, once said, we're greedy, but long-term greedy, not short-term greedy. Well, that's a very narrow kind of cathedral thinking, very self-interested, very narrow. So how do we broaden it? We need another approach to thinking long-term. And this is now the idea of intergenerational justice. This is about taking responsibility for future generations, people and planet, and injecting long-term thinking into our political processes. Because you can have all the sustainable development goals in the world that you like, but if your politics is still incredibly short-term, you're not going to get very far. And I think one of the most inspiring starting points for thinking about intergenerational justice is the idea of seventh generation decision-making, which was talked about in the introduction there. And here's a wonderful quote from Chief Oren Lyons from the Onondaga Nation, from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, sometimes the Iroquois Confederacy. He says, we are looking ahead, as is one of the first mandates given us as chiefs, to make sure every decision we make relates to the welfare and well-being of the seventh generation to come. And that is the basis by which we make decisions in council. Will this be to the benefit of the seventh generation? And this kind of decision-making, you know, is used in many communities around the world, in the Moluccas Islands and elsewhere, but it tells us about a kind of ethic of ecological stewardship. But there's a question there of how do you translate these kinds of ideas which have developed out of deep indigenous cosmologies and worldviews and bring them into the high-speed, hyper-individualistic world of Miami, Dubai, or Shanghai? Well, there's actually some really inspiring organizations and movements which have taken the seventh generation idea and started putting it into practice. One of them is a legal movement in the US called Our Children's Trust, which has filed a landmark case against the US federal government, as well as state governments, on behalf of the 21 young people you can see there who are campaigning for the legal right to a safe climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. Okay? And this is like a David versus Goliath struggle, but it's one of the most important legal struggles since the French Revolution, I think, because it's about giving rights to future people who may be born years or decades from today. It's extraordinary. And Our Children's Trust is impacting on legal movements around the world. There are other cases and other lawsuits going on in Uganda and Tanzania. In the Netherlands, there's been the well-known Urgenda case. There's a case brought by 6 Portuguese young people against EU countries recently, campaigning for rights for current and future generations to a fossil-free world. But there's also been interesting legal work in not just giving rights to future generations, future people, but to give rights to the living world. So in Aotearoa, New Zealand, for example, the Wanganui River has been given the same legal rights as a person. And as you probably know, in the 19th century, legal rights were given to corporations. Well, I'm quite glad that at last we're starting to give rights to Mother Earth, to rivers and to mountains. And there's much more important work that can be done in this area. And another second movement, which is really inspired by the seventh generation idea, was the one you just heard about earlier, which was the future design movement in Japan, which, as you now know, is really about local government decision-making. And they, you know, invite people to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live. And as you heard, they tend to divide people into two groups. Half are told they're residents from the present day, and the other half are given these most ceremonial robes to wear. I was recently given one as a present. I'm rather pleased with it. It's just in the corner of my office there. And they're told to imagine themselves as residents from the year 2060. And it turns out the residents from 2060 systematically advocate far more transformative city plans, from long-term healthcare investment to action on climate change or AI or responding to COVID. And the interesting thing about future design as a methodology is that it is spreading fast. It's now being used in big cities like Kyoto, companies like Fujitsu, and I'm delighted to hear that it's going to be part of this intergovernmental panel on art and climate change and the workshops you're going to be running tomorrow. And I think every culture and every country needs to try and adapt these kinds of methods to their own context. But there's so much richness, I think, in using our capacity to think beyond the here and now, to engage in what I call the temporal pirouette. The fact that the human imagination is extraordinary. It can jump across time horizons. One moment we can be looking at our phones, sending a text. The next moment we can be writing song lists for our own funerals or thinking about the world that will be inherited by our grandchildren in 2060 or beyond. So that's something about intergenerational justice. But let me now say something about this, about the idea of developing a legacy mindset. And the idea of legacy is really fundamental. And I'm hoping here you haven't got my, I'm not sharing my screen anymore. You're just back at looking at me now. That the idea of a legacy mindset is trying to think about how we will be remembered by the generations to come. I'm just checking whether the spotlight has come on me or not. I think it's not. I might be very small. Oh, it is.
No, I think you're big. Yeah.
Okay, great. It's all right. I don't need to feel big, but it might be easier for people to see. But I think what the idea of thinking about our legacies is very fundamental. You know, if you're a Russian oligarch, you might think your legacy is going to be, you want your legacy to be, have a wing of an art gallery named after you or a football stadium. Okay? But I'm talking about a different kind of legacy. I'm talking about moving beyond even that kind of egoistic legacy, moving beyond a familial sense of legacy. Of course, we all want to leave legacies to our children or grandchildren. You know, it could be, you know, a home or wealth or passing on culture and languages. But it's also fundamental that we stretch our legacy imaginations beyond that to, I guess, what I sometimes think of as the universal strangers of the future. How do we do that? How do we make that leap? Well, I'd like you to take you on a short imaginative journey in order to do this. I'd like you to just all close your eyes for a moment. And I'd like you just to imagine a young person in your life who you really care about. It could be a nephew or niece or your own child or grandchild. I just want you to picture their face with your eyes closed. And now I'd like you to imagine them 30 years in the future. Again, picture their face with your eyes closed. Think about the joys in their life and the struggles they might be facing. Just hold that thought in your mind for a moment. And now, with your eyes still closed, imagine them on their 90th birthday party. They're 90 years old, and they're surrounded by family and friends and loved ones and neighbors and old work colleagues in a lovely room. Now, just go and have a look out the window. What kind of world do you see out there? And now you see someone come over and put a tiny baby into their arms. It's their first great-grandchild. And then this 90-year-old is about to give a birthday speech and suddenly sees a photo of you, their departed dead ancestor, over on the wall, and decides to tell the gathered room about the legacy that you left them and the world that they live in. Just think for a moment, in a bit of silence with your eyes shut, about what they said in their speech about you and the legacy that you left them. And now just slowly open your eyes again and come back into the present moment. Now, I know that for a lot of people, that kind of imaginative exercise can be quite confronting, particularly if you've got a dark vision of the future. But I think it's a really important way of helping us make a very visceral connection with those generations of the future. Because certainly when I think about, say, my 12-year-old daughter, when she's 90, I mean, that could be almost the year 2100. I see that she's not alone in the world. She's part of a web of human relationships, but also part of the web of the living world, the air she breathes and the water she drinks, the food she eats. So if I care about her life in the future, her future life, I need to care about all life. So as you can see, that thinking about our familial legacies, those familial intergenerational connections, is a bridge to something wider, something much more transcendent, to caring, as I said, about the universal strangers of the future, and not just the people, but the planet that they live on. And there's lots of, I think really interesting art projects actually that tap into this kind of legacy thinking. Let me just share another one of these with you, just sharing my screen. And the one that comes to my mind is a project called Future Library, created by the Scottish artist Katie Patterson. It's a 100-year art project where every year for 100 years, a famous writer is depositing a book which will be left in the Future Library, and it will be printed only in the year 2114 on paper made from 1,000 trees which have been planted in a forest outside Oslo. The first person to donate a book was the Canadian writer Margaret Atwood, Elif Shafak, Han Kang, many others have donated books since. But just think that Margaret Atwood is never going to meet any of her readers. It'll never be published in her lifetime. It's an extraordinary legacy gift. And I think we can all think about the kind of legacy gifts that we might want to leave to future generations. But when we're thinking about legacies, we can also think about how we can be part of longer processes, passing on things from one generation to another. And I would like to just tell you about a little, a sort of an art ritual, landscape ritual that I've been involved in with some colleagues from the Long Now Foundation. Just about 20 miles south from where I live in Oxford in the UK, there is an incredible Bronze Age artwork over 3,000 years old called the White Horse of Uffington. It's a gigantic white horse you can see there, about 100 meters long, carved into the chalk hillside out of the grass. And every year for the last 1,000 years or so, local people have been going to do an annual ritual called re-chalking the horse. They bash bits of chalk back into the horse, into its form, and they take out the weeds. And this is what I took part with my colleagues from the Long Now Foundation, and members of the public can do that. You can see us there re-chalking the horse. And it's an extraordinary thing to be part of one of these long-term rituals, a ritual of maintenance, really. It really raises a question about what we want to maintain, what we want to keep from the past, and what we want to leave. Some things we want to keep, like an amazing Bronze Age artwork like this. Other things we could leave behind, like colonial era racism and slavery, which continues to create deep inequities in our societies and must be repaired. But projects like this can help us expand our imaginations and put us in a longer stretch of time and help us think about the legacies that we will leave. And I like to think that, you know, when I'm dead, there'll still be people re-chalking the great White Horse of Uffington. But let me just stand back and finish now and recognize that what I'm talking about here is expanding our time horizons, getting out of those short-term cycles of seconds and minutes, the buy now button, the 24/7 news, the stock market, and extending our horizons towards decades, towards centuries, towards millennia, as Joseph Salk advises. We can do this. We can build flood defenses. We can rewild the landscape. We can create seed banks. You know, these are all different ways we can walk into a longer now. But let's remember that long-term thinking isn't just about expanding our horizon in time. It's also about reconnecting with place. If you think about it, how have other species survived for 10,000 generations or more? Well, it's by taking care of the place that will take care of their offspring, whether they're birds or beavers or bears, by not fouling the nest, by living within the ecosystem in which they are embedded. And this is what humans have been failing to do at an ever-increasing pace and scale over the last century. So our task really is to reconnect with the land and to fall in love with the savannas, with the ice sheets, with the rivers and the meadows and the mountains. And I think, at least for me, a parting thought I'd like to share with you is a proverb from the Mohawk people, in Native American Mohawk people, which is spoken when a child is born. Thank you, Earth. You know the way.